There we go. All right. See if this works. Because you are live. Yeah. You might just have to refresh it or go. Are you using? Oh, you're using like YouTube website, not YouTube app. You might just have to refresh it. So it'll pop up. All right. It's working. This is working. Okay. All right. Oh, they're not back here.
Okay, what would they be?
Okay, so I look at you better. I had to bring my makeup and put my makeup on. Running real late. Yeah, I did. I told Donna I'm not turning the TV on. I'm leaving a lot on the bridge last night. Yeah, I didn't read a whole lot, but I did the same thing. I read. See what you're looking for a little one. I don't know. I don't see him. They were in a box. Look, I look up behind the.
There we go.
I didn't, I was just back there. Oh, you look before. Oh, this is a Walmart special. My butt's showing, I got to put my thing on.
Hello?
Wet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody's hearing aids, he forgot a lot of stuff. I said, I guess we're getting older. We can't do this. We need to get up earlier. We got up at 6.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I thought we just sat in our chairs. No. I'm gonna see if I can talk.
You talking to me?
Do what?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. I have you on speaker so I can put the DVD player DVD in.
Okay.
I just gotta find out what DVD they're gonna use because there's 2 of them.
I'll let you go. Just let's see if you can kind of mic her some way so we can hear her teach.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Uh-huh.
She told text John, I'll see you Sunday. That didn't happen. She wanted to do that. She wanted to know what she could do for me. And Don said, no, you just got home, you just got started driving yesterday. You don't need to do anything for me. Eddie's her husband, and he, he was in Hamilton, then he was Stevensville, and Dr. worked there every day, because, they finally called, Eddie David was and his sister. And Grandparents, and the sister and sister, and his brother lives in Greenville. They had been together, and that's been quiet. I love them, Donna said, I don't know what the world, so I just got to have this stuff, Well, yeah, I hope you do it. I don't either. They have a very informal. They said to use it. We didn't have a video, they just have to see, okay, I need to. Yeah, that's the discussion. I got 3 cards here that I would like you ladies to sign. One's for Betty. And I couldn't see it for those on the last ones, but I thought, well, I just have them to sign that, and that's one like that. Okay. So, she said, well, she wanted to, it is 6. I wasn't sure she was in the book, and she had. Right. Hey, I don't know what. Thank you, ma'am. You're welcome. You need one of these?
I already got one. Thank you.
We probably all need one of these. So we're away. I know, but I think it was nice. It was like 98. I need to go home and change the sweater top. It looks beautiful. It does? Well, I'll suffer if I look beautiful. It's not good.
I wish I wore my stripes.
It's Donna, I'm sure that. You know what, I'm going up there too. Wow.
They got plenty of help.
I know, but I need to tell it that mine, I need to eat. That is water in it. Okay. Is anybody going up there? What's Brenda? Is she staying up there? Okay. I just need to tell them to put a little water in my ham and turkey. Before they heat it.
Oh, wow.
I'll have up there and call them for you. Well, I don't think it'll work up there. Would you mind? Peggy, tell Brenda that,
The water in your cooking.
a little bit, just a little bit, yeah.
Did I get this thing?
Yeah, I think going to the left.
I guess we just.
Don't let it go each.
I guess we need one double. No, okay, well, maybe you did, I thought. No, I didn't. I had looked at my book. too, yeah. And I
Well,
sure that's what we were doing.
I didn't read the whole chapter. What was interesting to me was the introduction. Did y'all read the introduction? Yes. That was very, I love that. Yeah. Yes, yeah, I love that. I think we should talk about that. I didn't know if anybody would read it or not, but I thought that was very good.
Well, good. If we want to talk about that, we will do that, and that you, you're all right back there waiting till we get ready for you? Okay. Talk about that, and then, once we get done, that might be something. Yeah, you want them here.
Before y'all get started, was this guy, was he not a Christian? He didn't act like it. No. What is, how do you put it, he probably became a Christian, but yeah, he
He described himself as, I think it's what he said he was, or maybe. Yeah, that's the second paragraph. They just said, Roslyn is watching since the time.
yeah, hello, Roslyn. Did everybody sign their cards?
No.
Can you bring them back here and let these ladies sign?
That's good.
Yeah, they did, Samantha didn't get one.
Wait, have we meant to sign anything today?
Samantha must be coming because she's pregnant.
No, these are a little more intense. You need both of them. And they, that's the back they questionnaire.
I should not do it, but
Oh, did you?
never got the town.
That's
The
good.
mix across the community.
You know what, I got that recipe. Linda, it's really good.
You can mix it in there, and you can want to bring it back and I guess, I'm wrong without my pen. I'm wrong with my pen and paper this morning.
Hey, does anybody have any money in here today?
Have a little one?
Yeah. We have the big one. That's the little one. Yeah, the bigger You know what, count people in here, one of those missing, there's a bunch up there. No, Brenda probably has it up there, she's up there in the kitchen. Just count how many we got and tell her that's it.
6.
I don't guess anybody has any money. Yeah, I needed to up there, took one, she took,
He went up there to
she
deliver
went up there
that.
to tell Don something. So,
Oh, another 7 here,
Yeah.
Brenda's 8.
and you know what, your wife is not keeping the anniversary, you want to tell her.
9.
No,
So I'm gonna try to say 9.
no,
Can't.
Hey.
We didn't count.
Donna. Oh, no, count, Donna used to count.
Okay.
Ten.
10, okay.
If you see any more, just add a bunch to it.
Okay.
Hey, are you going back up to church? Are you going back up there, building? Can you do me a favor?
Sure.
Would you take my makeup, I can do my makeup and put it on up here, I didn't have time.
You put it on the bar.
I was using the truck.
Okay, I should have.
Thank you.
Just don't give me that.
Thank you.
David, you need makeup?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, careful, because they all take that, and they're all there. Yeah. Yes, we did, we found the box. Oh, that's what she said. I said, I bet she does, she's got the dress in. Okay. Well, that's all right.
Is everybody, anybody have any special care requests?
Well, Don heard from the nurse this morning about Eddie, and he's not having, he's feeling better. But, he wants his vitamins now, he wanted them yesterday. Don said, you tell him I'll bring him tomorrow, I'm not coming today.
Well, if he needs vitamins, they will give him vitamins.
Anita's doing really well, she's staying by herself. Now, the brother-in-law, Eddie's brother-in-law, took her up there yesterday, to see after that's the first time she's seen him. So, but, you know, I don't know if y'all heard the ladies, but they did the surgery, they did the gallbladder surgery, they didn't even cut it out. But the stone is lodged in his, in the gut. And with him not feeling good, they said it's probably not taking the water and have another surgery to get those out. So, you know, we don't know that. They're running a test Tuesday, and that's the earliest that we run. I guess we're going to get the report back maybe. Yeah, and he still can't use the bathroom.
And then they found the water, so he was like, we in for one thing, and then they found something else in the treaty. The second thing, apparently more than the first, but
They
they
said
said
the
what they said.
gallbladder was, I think it's just something. You know, that's a survey we can say that it's
Well, I
something.
mean, you know, we did it, so. Okay, is there anybody else that needs special prayer? How's your friend at the blind surgery?
Five surgeries in 1 year.
Oh my God, 5 surgeries.
Five surgeries.
Oh my.
3 on his back and 1 on his
How can you? Your mom did, you spend a lot, yeah.
Can you hear me?
And remember, we have cards up here beside, one for Eddie and two for Dave.
if not, then you never find, you think you still have to do time. He said that
I called her and talked to her one day. She said that, you know, the what they had the first time, or the oncologist said that she didn't have radiation, chemo, that said, how many people do that because the radiation is real strong and nuts. So, yeah, that was one option. And then said that if they get in there and find it, this is not, that or anything that's possible, safety, safety. You know, and that was all I told her about, you know, and well,
So they're still down there now.
oh, yeah, they're gonna be there. So really, Washington says Monday, but text said Monday or Tuesday, and that would say Tuesday, Wednesday.
That would be one thing different.
It's supposed to be Wednesday.
Um,
It's supposed to be Wednesday through Wednesday, so.
I would definitely need to be thinking constantly, and I think most of us already do, you know, really do use that reminder, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded. And, you know, we have our problems, all of us have illnesses and aches and pains, but it takes very little to look around and see somebody that's not going to work out. And it just makes me more aware of how good about it. Okay, we're gonna start. Oh, yeah, definitely. She was, when I had texted her yesterday after yesterday morning, she said she told me she would be here this morning, we got to take that time. There she was. Okay, we're gonna take 14 of your bigger book. And suggested we divide up in groups, but I think we're small enough groups, we can do this on our own. What's your favorite Christmas movie? How about a favorite character? And is there a favorite memory you can share of the time you watched this movie with your family or friends?
I don't know that it's not Christmas. It's that, you know, those funny characters, you know, where, Eddie, I think his name, he comes up and it's like, you know. Yes, yeah, yes, yeah, I will always remember that. Okay,
That's your option, I'll do that.
yeah.
Yes.
Like to be a Christmas story. And I think the big thing about those Christmas activities. My kids, my boys, that's my boys. That we do.
It was very good.
So this movie is just funny.
Yeah, I got different times just because as a mother, the with her, that we were watching Christmas movies nonstop on Hallmark Channel. Because she, you know, Faith never remember she did watch it continuously, you know, so this is a new experience for her to have them where it just, you know, put it back together. So I think Debbie's kind of getting an overload at the Christmas movie before Christmas even gets here, but, that is a pleasure to have somebody to watch Christmas movies with. And my favorite is still, one Jimmy Stewart, you know, no, but something else is, I'll think of it in a minute. When a bell ring, every time a bell rings and I can get you wings, it's a wonderful life. Yeah, it's a wonderful life. To me, that's when Christmas starts, when I can watch that movie, and then I'm ready for Christmas. But that's when we always watch. And I've had it on tape that I showed. Some of the things they show at Christmas are totally non-Christian. They have absolutely nothing to do with why we as Christians celebrate Christmas. So this is the type taste of Christmas. I did not get it all, even the first chapter, because I was really busy yesterday. So excuse me, this is true. But anyway, we need to concentrate on what Christmas is about. Why we celebrate Christmas, and we certainly need to pass that on to our kids and our grandkids, because they are not getting it in the world. We can't have Christmas holidays anymore. They have dinner break, or they have this and that, but it's not Christmas. You don't do that. In our world, we're being so pressured, I guess is the word I'm trying to think of, by what the world thinks and believes, that our belief, if we're not careful, we can lose our belief and lose the ability to pass it on to others. There's always a chance to witness to somebody, even if it's on a blessed day. You don't have to say anything, you can have a blessed day. And so there's just little opportunities that we need to be aware of. And I think this is especially so commercial, and I'm really dating myself, but I think I'm younger than most of y'all. We live so many years in Miers Christmas catalog. I mean, that was a big deal. Now you remember that? Yeah, I mean, that was the big.
We never went shopping, we had to do it.
Yeah. But I mean, we spent hours just going through it, and knowing that we probably weren't gonna get anything out of it, but it was fun, You can have to do that. I mean, shopping channel, or, or like on the video that we see, kids are exposed to, it's a totally secular. They're just not getting what they need to get. They're not getting it. And so we as a church family need to encourage our young people, our leaders of our young people, to do what God calls us to do in order to spread the gospel and continue the gospel. Okay, anybody else remember Christmas movie or memory with what Sherry West?
I remember Christmas, when I was a little girl in a tomboy, and I got a truck that had lights in it. And my sister had a doll, and she wanted to play with my sled. And I had no leather, and my mom made me leather, and she turned it on, and my leg broke a light.
Oh, no.
I never looked at it. Back in my day, you only got one sled in.
Yeah.
That was warm, and you were like fortunate to get warm.
I had one of those sisters, she's 8 years old, and she had 4 little children. And I remember again, that day, was my grandmother, on Christmas Eve, and she gave me a scarf. And I remember thinking then, and I still think about that, oh, it's such a nice gift. She didn't have, I just think, that was really a sacrifice for her to do that. She had 4 little kids to buy for her, and that was good. She was with her at a very early age. Right, I think that's skirt. So that's because I thought, oh my goodness, that's such a nice present, we can have so much. And then about that, that's the person she did.
Did she sell?
She did so. It was a bomb skirt, but most
I know, we had a food factory, and they tried to make sure we got 4 or 5 that had the same print. And that's all I ever had. That,
and you remember those things. So it was kind of. I don't do this here. You go in, my son's house was but even before that, before the church and everything, we would do some service and put you through
That's Belmont from here.
Yeah, it's already up there, next to the, right there on the, next to the offering plates.
Oh, okay. And you'll turn it on for me?
Yeah.
I mean,
You can turn it on right here, but I can have it muted. And then I can just turn it on as soon
Yeah,
as.
why don't you do that? I'll turn it on when I get up, when I put it on.
Yeah, and I'll have it
And then
muted,
you
and then
have
I'll
it
just
muted.
and I'll just unmute it as soon as you start talking.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
That they put nothing on paper things, but they didn't put Jesus in the name of it, for Christmas Eve night. Because that, when he was born, so that was reinforcing that the meaning of Christmas. That's kind of neat, you know, how we put it out together, but I never, yeah. But that's something you might, you know, think about. But I've loved to make this for years, and when I quit collecting them, between ornaments and making stuff, I've had over 150, so I had, and I don't. Anymore, I don't put them out, but anyway, I had one really pretty one that my girlfriend had made for me, and, I mean, big ceramic one, and I got it out, and I didn't have a baby Jesus on there, so I called her, and I said, she made one for, had one made for me and for her daughter, and I said, look at her stuff and see if maybe yours too. But she hadn't, she had made up to go in one, but she had to make her baby Jesus. One year, we had a little baby. Janet had a baby. It was October the 15th, and she was a nervous wreck. She stood back there because we needed to have a whole baby, but she was very, and that baby slept through the whole thing. What a blessing. Yeah. Well, yeah. You have a book for you? Are you sure we have? Yeah. Okay, what is your family's tradition as it relates to opening of presents, opening the gift on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning?
No. Have it in my calendar.
Okay, Nancy, what did y'all do? Open gift Christmas morning or?
It'll be the 30th. Yeah, it's the last Wednesday of the month. So it's not this coming Wednesday, but the following Wednesday.
Wanda, Christmas morning or Christmas Eve? Maybe I never have Christmas on Christmas with the kids and mom because we had to be on this one day. So we have always had Christmas, or like now, when we just have to learn the kids from the yet, and we don't exchange yet. That's right. When your kids get older, and you're a ceremony. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, our daughter-in-law, the only one, you know, my son-in-law, and cooking is on the posting at the time, so she usually comes to work on Christmas, you know, because she gets Thanksgiving off and she works on Christmas, and never be available until we have Christmas, because it's usually just that, but we always go get mom. And, we don't exchange gifts. My sister-in-law, with each other. And Terry and I have never, maybe two sisters in our whole life, have we given each other Christmas gifts. We just don't do that. We fight with other people that we didn't. If we want something, you know, it's that. The most fun Christmas that we have, it might not have been Christmas Day, but all the in-laws and family got it. Everybody just got one present. We did this game that we pass it when the music stops. And you have, and in the end, if you wanted to, you could change with other people. And it was so much fun. All right, Don and I, we grew up, yeah, but I go to a different organization and but we always keep on using our cats.
Now, you thought you went to Chelsea.
We have 50 of my grandmothers and me.
Although for our kids, we've been there. Okay, we need to watch the video and then we'll make it a little bit more time. Just one other thing, so do you have an activity thing that you just like? So like, I can hear,
What out, yeah.
yes. Everybody? Wanda, do you have an activity set?
Well, I don't. Okay, but it's 50 days and I don't have it.
Would you like to have one little one-piece one? It only takes up about this much room.
Don't you have a mic?
Okay, I will get you one, I promise. Okay, I think we're ready.
You know, even when I was an atheist, I loved Christmas time because I managed to focus on all the superficial trappings of the holiday instead of the spiritual dimension. I mean, what's not to like about Christmas? You got gift giving, you got holiday parties, you get cards from relatives and friends. And I was like anybody else. I loved sitting by the warm fireplace, sipping on some hot chocolate. Back in those days, probably something a little more potent. And enjoying time with family and relatives and friends. I think lots of people like me just enjoy the sentimental side of the season. In fact, many of my atheist buddies would rank the Christmas season as one of their favorite times of the year. But after my wife Leslie became a Christian and I started to investigate the identity of Jesus, I began to probe into the real meaning of those nativity scenes that I'd see outside of churches. I wanted to separate the holiday from the holy day, the facts from the fantasy, the truth from the tradition, and get down to the historic bedrock of what Christmas is all about. What I found thoroughly fascinated me. I mean, I expected to discover that Christmas is built on flimsy legends that developed in the many decades after Jesus lived. I thought the virgin birth would be exposed as some sort of fanciful idea that was plagiarized from earlier mythology. I didn't anticipate that the opposite would happen, that a thorough investigation of the ancient history would validate the Christmas narrative because it's based on reliable sources that are too immediate to be written off as being mere legend or make-believe. So I'd like to share some of what I've learned with you. I'm so glad that you're joining me for this 4-week experience as we set aside Santa Claus and Christmas trees and delve instead into the question of what we can really know with confidence about the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a journey that I'm convinced will stimulate your mind, it'll warm your heart, it'll satisfy your soul. And forever, I believe it will change the way that you celebrate Christmas. It is, after all, the greatest story of history. And as you know, the greatest stories of history are the ones that turn out to be true. When we investigate Christmas, we not only have to separate the commercial aspects of Christmas from the spiritual roots of the holiday, but we also need to drill down deeply into the historical record to determine exactly what did take place in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. Because sometimes we find that legends have contaminated the actual account of what really took place. Let me give you an example. Here's the storyline we typically hear at Christmas, even in many of our churches. To comply with a census being conducted by the Roman Emperor Augustus, Joseph and the pregnant Mary set out on a donkey to go to Bethlehem, since Joseph was a descendant from the house of David. The baby starts to arrive as they approach the village, so they urgently are seeking shelter. But the mean old innkeeper tells them there's no vacancy. That is, there's no room for them at the inn. And this forces Mary and Joseph into a nearby stable or cave where Mary gives birth amongst the animals. The child is then wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a manger. Sounds familiar, right? And yet, as I investigated Christmas, I found that that's probably not exactly what happened in terms of how Luke describes the real Christmas. First, it would have been unthinkable in the first century for anyone to turn away a pregnant Jewish woman who was seeking shelter. I mean, hospitality was such an extremely high value in those days. In fact, one scholar said to turn away a descendant of David in the city of David would be an unspeakable shame on the entire village. The person who turned her away would be ostracized from the community. Second, and I'm sorry if I pop any bubbles or meddle with any Christmas carols here, but there was probably no inn and probably no innkeeper. Yeah, there were some commercial lodgings that were available in the first century, but probably not in Bethlehem. It was a small community and it wasn't on a major road. Besides, many scholars doubt whether Luke is talking about a hotel at all. You see, the Greek word that many Bibles translate as inn is katalima. This word is used twice in the New Testament, where Luke and Mark describe the place where the Last Supper was held. Now, in that instance, the word clearly means a spare or upper room in a private house. Now, if Luke had wanted to describe a commercial lodging of some sort, he had another Greek word he certainly would have used. But he didn't use that other Greek word. He did when he told the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. But here, Luke specifically chose the word katalima to talk about the birth of Jesus. And katalima is best translated as guest room. In fact, the NIV Bible translates Luke 2, verse 7, as saying that Mary gave birth, wrapped Jesus in cloths, and placed him in a manger, quote, because there was no guest room available for them. Many scholars say this is the most accurate translation. In fact, as far back as the year 1395, John Wycliffe's translation of Luke 2, verse 7, rendered katalima as a chamber or a room, not some sort of commercial inn. But then subsequent translations, for some reason, and that includes the King James Version, use the word inn, and that's become part of our Christmas culture. Now, in his book, Urban Legends of the New Testament, scholar David Croteau describes how first century homes looked in the Middle East. There was generally one large room broken down into two parts. There was the family room where cooking and eating and sleeping took place. And then there were a few steps down to the animal room, where the family donkey, cow, and a sheep or two would be kept. Now, these animals were brought inside the last thing at night, and they're taken outside the first thing in the morning. Now, this floor in the animal room was slanted toward the outside for easy cleaning. But sometimes the larger animals would come up the stairs into the family room. And so each area had its own manger or feeding trough, which was usually built into the floor and filled with hay for the animals to eat. Now, here's the thing. Some houses added a second room off the family room, which was called the guest room, and it would have had its own exterior entrance. This was the katalima that Luke was referring to. There was no room for Mary and Joseph in the katalima, the guest room. What's more, Mary apparently wasn't on the verge of giving birth as she and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. This idea can be traced back to an apocryphal work of fiction called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is from the 2nd century. It's a work that doesn't have any connection to James, who was a half-brother of Jesus, or James the Apostle. It's mostly legendary stuff. Again, we have to pay close attention to what Luke reports, since he was writing much closer to the events after interviewing eyewitnesses. In fact, Luke says in the prologue of his gospel that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning so he could write an orderly account of the certainty of what took place. Well, Luke chapter 2, verse 6 says that, quote, the time for the baby to be born came, quote, while they were there in Bethlehem. Luke doesn't portray this as being an urgent or emergency situation that occurred as they were approaching the village. As one scholar said, he doesn't mention whether they were there for 5 minutes or 5 weeks, but it could allow for both. In other words, there was probably no panic involved. Oh, and one more thing. What about the idea that Mary gave birth in a cave? Actually, the Gospels don't mention a cave at all. In fact, the idea of a cave can be traced back to Christian apologist Justin Martyr, who was writing much later. He was writing in the middle of the 2nd century. So, what really happened on that first Christmas? Well, Joseph and the pregnant Mary arrived in Bethlehem to register for the census. They went to the house of a friend or a relative, but there was no room for them in the guest room, probably because of the crowd of people who'd already arrived for the census. So they were invited to stay in their family room, where Mary gave birth, and the child was placed in the clean hay of a feeding trough, where he was subsequently encountered by the shepherds who had been alerted to his birth by the angels. Now, these are, I think, fascinating details, but the bottom line truth of Christmas remains unchanged. Jesus gave up his throne in heaven to enter into our world as a baby lying in a manger. Now, it's a legitimate question to ask whether we can trust the gospel accounts. How do we know they're telling us the truth? How do we know that they're reliable? Can we be sure that they're trustworthy when they describe the birth, the teachings, the death, and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus? Well, I started out as a skeptic, but I eventually emerged convinced that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are accurate in what they tell us about Jesus. After all, each of these fall within the historical genre of ancient biographies, which were intended, to one degree or another, to report what actually took place in the life of a notable person. And as I've demonstrated in my books, these Gospels bear the earmarks of accuracy. First, they were written a lot closer to the events they describe than some of the critics claim. How do we know? Well, let's consider the Gospel of Luke, which has the most details about the birth of Jesus. Luke was a physician and close companion of the Apostle Paul. Scholars agree that he wrote the book of Acts, which describes the early spread of Christianity. But the book ends unfinished because its central figure, Paul, is under house arrest in Rome. Now, we don't find out from Acts what happens to Paul. And beyond that, Acts doesn't describe several other major events that happened in the AD 60s, like the martyrdom of Peter and James, and the Roman-Greco War, and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. So Acts was apparently written before those events occurred, meaning that we can date it before about AD 62. Now, we know that Acts is the second of a two-part work written by Luke, the earlier one being the Gospel of Luke. So we can date the Gospel of Luke to around AD 60, or perhaps a little bit earlier. Now, keep in mind that Jesus was killed in AD 30 or 33. So we're talking about a very short time gap. And we know that one of Luke's sources was Mark. So his gospel is even earlier. Now, this dating is especially significant when you consider that one of the greatest historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford University, determined that in the ancient world, the passage of 2 generations of time was not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. And yet, Luke's gospel was written within the same generation when Jesus lived. A second reason we can trust the Gospels is that archaeology has consistently affirmed the biblical record, to the point where Luke has been described by scholars as a first-rate historian. In fact, sometimes skeptics have believed that Luke was wrong about something, only to have later discoveries prove that, well, Luke was right after all. Let me just give you an example. Luke says that after Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, he grew up in Nazareth. Yet, skeptics claimed for years that Nazareth didn't even exist in the first century. They cite the fact that Nazareth isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, it's not mentioned by the Apostle Paul or in the Jewish Talmud. In fact, no historians mention it before the beginning of the 4th century. However, in 2006, the Nazareth Archaeological Project began excavating beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. And guess what they found? A house from the era of Jesus. What's more, inside they discovered limestone vessels, which Jews believed could not become impure. Now, what does this suggest? This suggests this was a Jewish home, right there in Nazareth from Jesus' era. 3 years later, guess what happened? Another house from Jesus' days was unearthed nearby. Once again, Luke was shown to have been exactly correct. Nazareth did exist in Jesus' day. So there are good reasons to trust Luke and the other Gospels as well when they tell us about Jesus. But then why don't Mark and John describe the birth of Jesus? Some skeptics have said that the absence of a birth narrative in those 2 Gospels, as well as in the writings of the Apostle Paul, undermines the historical record about how Jesus entered the world. But this, friends, is an argument from silence. And arguments from silence are notoriously unconvincing. Not all the Gospels report each and every event in Jesus' life. In fact, John, being the last Gospel that was written, doesn't repeat a lot of the material that was already known in the earlier Gospels, including the Sermon on the Mount. Yet, interestingly, someone who tradition tells us was personally mentored by John the Apostle surely emerged believing in the virgin birth. His name was Ignatius, and he became the Bishop of Antioch. Now, in the year AD 108, he wrote a letter in which he explicitly says that Jesus was, quote, truly born of a virgin. Now, where did he learn that from? Could it be that he learned it from his mentor, the author of the Gospel of John? As for Mark, he simply doesn't deal with Jesus' early years in his Gospel. That's a literary choice he made. However, he does implicitly reference the unusual nature of Jesus' birth when he quotes someone in Mark 6, verse 3, as referring to Jesus as, quote, the son of Mary. Now, normally a Jewish person would be identified with his father's name, even if his dad were deceased. But here we have an implicit acknowledgement that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus. Something was unusual about his birth. As for why the Apostle Paul doesn't mention the circumstances of Jesus' birth, the answer is that it simply wasn't relevant to the issues that prompted him to write the epistles. Besides, Paul doesn't mention a lot of details about Jesus that are already covered in the Gospels. For instance, he never mentions Mary or Joseph or Nazareth. So are we to presume they didn't exist? Of course not. So, what have we learned so far? That the historical record of the birth of Jesus needs to be taken seriously. the Gospels are our best source about what really took place 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary. If it were all a fairy tale, akin to Santa Claus and elves, we could dismiss it as merely being, a childhood fantasy without any practical implications for our lives. But because it's true, Christmas cannot be ignored. In the end, the child in the manger deserves our allegiance, and he deserves our worship. I'm struck in the end by the humility displayed by Jesus in his birth. Here he is, the eternal God who created the entire universe. And as John 1 verse 14 says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He entered into our world in the most primitive and unpretentious way. As Philippians 2:7 describes it, Christ Jesus made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And that should tell you and me that whatever our circumstances, no matter how modest, no matter how dire, no matter how difficult, Jesus offers to enter into our world and to bring his grace and his truth into our individual situation. As Christian author Philip Yancey put it, as I read the birth stories about Jesus, I cannot help but conclude that though the world may be tilted toward the rich and powerful, God is tilted toward the underdog. If you haven't invited Jesus into your life, or if you haven't turned over your worries or your problems to him, then I hope that by the end of this study, that you will. Believe me, that would make this the best Christmas of all.
Thank you, Dave. But there is a section in there for you to do. If you're reading lessons for next week, hopefully George will be back, but I think it's just like a we watched the first movie. That was okay. Section 1. This is actually yeah, let's do section 1. Section 1. Well, that's one section. And then we've done three. Well, we didn't.
Haven't been here.
Yeah. We talked about 30 minutes before they get to the video.
Well, I sat outside and talked to Ashley, you know that. I'm just like this. Randy Corner, she getting better.